Power is a funny thing. In the wrong hands, it's a blunt weapon used to belittle, control, and demean. But true power doesn't need to shout, and it certainly doesn't wear a tin badge just to bully strangers on a dark highway. When a power-tripping local cop decided to humiliate a black motorist, he assumed was just another low-level grunt. He had no idea he had just handcuffed the very man who controlled his department's entire operational budget. Listen closely, because karma rarely hits this hard, and the fallout is legendary. The Texas heat rarely forgave, even late at night. The air hovering over Interstate 35 was thick, smelling faintly of asphalt and dry brush. Everett Lang rolled his window down an inch, letting the rush of the warm night air circulate through the cabin of his meticulously restored 1968 Chevrolet Chevelle. The deep guttural purr of the V8 engine was a comforting rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that had accompanied him across multiple states. Everett was a man who moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. Beneath his casual attire, a plain white cotton button-down and faded jeans, was a physique forged by decades of relentless military discipline. His hair was cropped close and entirely silver, contrasting sharply with his deep, unblemished skin. He looked like any other tired traveler making his way through the sprawling expanse of the American South. But Everett was not just any traveler. He was Lieutenant General Everett Lang, the newly appointed base commander of Fort Kinsley, one of the largest and most strategically critical military installations in the country. He had chosen to drive himself to his new post, rather than take the military flight offered to him. The Chevelle had been his late father's, a rusted-out shell they had spent years rebuilding together. Driving it across the country to his crowning command assignment felt like a necessary pilgrimage. He was due on base in the morning for the official change of command ceremony, but tonight he just wanted a hot shower and a decent bed. To reach Fort Kinsley, you had to pass through Oak Creek. Oak Creek was one of those towns that clung to the edges of massive military bases. Its economy survived almost entirely on the paychecks of young enlisted soldiers looking for a cheap drink or a fast decision off post. It was a town of pawn shops, predatory car dealerships, and a police department that operated more like a private toll collection agency than a public safety institution. Everett had read the preliminary briefings on Oak Creek. The town's infrastructure was crumbling, and its police department was heavily subsidized by a joint jurisdiction security grant, a significant federal payout approved directly by the base commander of Fort Kinsley to ensure the local police assisted in keeping the peace off post. Everett's signature was the only thing keeping Oak Creek's municipal budget afloat. He was cruising at exactly the speed limit, the needle on his speedometer dead steady. He was a man of precision. He didn't break rules. He wrote them. As he passed the rusted welcome sign for Oak Creek, a set of headlights flared to life from the darkness of a concealed dirt access road. Everett's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror. He watched the vehicle pull out aggressively, its tires kicking up a cloud of pale dust. The car accelerated, closing the distance rapidly before riding dangerously close to the Chevelle's rear bumper. Everett didn't flinch. He maintained his speed, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Just a local in a hurry, he thought, preparing to ease slightly to the right to let the aggressive driver pass. Then the darkness shattered into a strobe of blinding red and blue. Everett sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion rather than anxiety. He checked his mirrors, signaled his intent, and pulled the heavy muscle car smoothly onto the gravel shoulder. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, and placed his keys visibly on the dashboard. He rolled his window down completely and placed both hands on the steering wheel. Standard procedure. He knew the drill. In the rearview mirror, he watched the silhouette of the officer step out of the cruiser. The man was broad-shouldered, walking with a heavy, exaggerated swagger that Everett had seen 1,000 times in young, untested recruits trying to project authority they hadn't earned. Officer Silas Grant approached the driver's side of the Chevelle. He was a man who enjoyed his uniform entirely too much. The leather of his duty belt creaked loudly in the quiet night. He paused at the rear taillight, pressing his thumb against the trunk, an old cop trick to leave a fingerprint in case the stop went south. Grant stepped up to the window and immediately shined a heavy, high-lumen mag light directly into Everett's eyes. "Do you know how fast you were going, boy?" Grant asked. His voice was a flat, nasal drawl, dripping with an immediate, unearned condescension. Everett closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the blatant disrespect wash over him. Boy. He hadn't been called that in decades. He kept his voice perfectly level, the tone of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. "I was doing exactly the speed limit, officer," Everett replied smoothly, turning his head slightly to avoid the blinding center of the flashlight beam. "Is that right?" Grant scoffed, leaning in closer. The smell of cheap stale coffee and chewing tobacco wafted into the car. "Funny, my radar had you going faster. In a hurry to get somewhere?" "No, sir," Everett said politely. "Just heading to my destination. And respectfully, your radar needs recalibration. I was monitoring my speed." Grant let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He lowered the flashlight slightly, illuminating the immaculate leather interior of the Chevelle. His eyes roved over the pristine dashboard, the shining chrome, and then settled back on Everett's face. The officer's expression hardened into a look of deep, prejudiced suspicion. "Nice ride," Grant said, the compliment sounding more like an accusation. "A 1968 original parts. Must have cost a fortune to restore. Whose car is it?" "It's mine," Everett stated simply. "Yours?" Grant chewed on the inside of his cheek, his eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe a guy like you owns a classic car like this?" Everett's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "A guy like you." The subtext was practically screaming. "I have the registration and insurance right here in the glove compartment, officer. With your permission, I'll retrieve them." "Keep your hands right where I can see them," Grant snapped, his hand dropping to rest aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. "Don't you move a muscle until I tell you to. License. Now, use your left hand. Slow and easy." Everett complied. He slowly reached into his left breast pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He extracted his civilian driver's license and held it out the window. Grant snatched the card, shining his light on it. "Everett Lang, Maryland address. You're a long way from home, Everett. What brings you to Oak Creek?" "I'm relocating for work," Everett said. "I'm stationed at Fort Kinsley." Grant looked up from the license, a smirk breaking across his face. "Stationed at Kinsley? Oh, I get it now. You're military." He looked Everett up and down, taking in the plain clothes. "What are you, some kind of supply clerk? Motor pool mechanic? Must be making a killing selling stolen base equipment on the black market to afford a car like this." The accusation was so wild, so blatantly offensive that Everett almost laughed. But the disciplined general within him took over. He realized he wasn't just dealing with a rude cop. He was dealing with a deeply prejudiced man carrying a badge and a gun. "I serve at Fort Kinsley, yes," Everett said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a commanding, resonant authority. "And I can assure you the vehicle was paid for legally, and my speed was lawful." "Listen to me carefully, soldier," Grant hissed, leaning his forearms against the door of the Chevelle. "I don't care how they do things up north. Down here, my town, my rules. You don't talk back to me. Now you're going to step out of this vehicle, and I'm going to search it to see exactly what you're smuggling into my jurisdiction." The demand hung heavily in the humid night air. Everett stared at the young officer, analyzing the situation with the same cold, tactical precision he used when reviewing combat deployment strategies. Officer Silas Grant wasn't just looking for a traffic ticket. He was looking for a confrontation. He was seeking the specific thrill that came from humiliating a black man who dared to drive a nicer car than he did, a man who possessed a quiet dignity that Grant clearly lacked. "I decline your request to search my vehicle," Everett said calmly. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You pulled me over for an alleged speeding violation. You have my license. Issue the citation, and I will be on my way. You have no probable cause to search my property." Grant's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated anger. He was a big fish in a tiny stagnant pond, and he was completely unaccustomed to being told no. "Probable cause?" Grant spat, taking a step back and unhooking the retention strap on his holster. I smell marijuana. That's all the probable cause I need. Now get out of the damn car before I drag you out through the window." Everett knew the game. The phantom scent of marijuana was the oldest, most cowardly trick in the corrupt cop playbook. An invisible, unprovable excuse used to trample over the Fourth Amendment. Everett hadn't smoked a day in his life. His military security clearances and regular medical screenings strictly forbade it. Everett calculated his next move. He could announce his rank. He could pull his Department of Defense identification card from his wallet, show Grant the 3 stars embossed next to his name, and watch the arrogant cop backpedal in sheer terror. But a thought stopped him. If he is treating me this way, how does he treat the young privates under my command? How many young, terrified kids from Fort Kinsley have had their rights violated, their pockets emptied, and their records stained by this badge-heavy bully? General Everett Lang decided right then and there. He wasn't going to pull rank. He was going to let Officer Grant dig his own grave, and he was going to document every single shovel strike. "I will exit the vehicle, officer," Everett said softly. "But I am stating clearly for your body camera, assuming it is turned on, that I do not consent to any searches or seizures." Everett pulled the handle and pushed the heavy door open. He stepped out onto the asphalt. Standing well over 6 feet, he was taller than Grant, and despite his age, his posture was rigidly straight, exuding a silent, overwhelming presence. Grant immediately felt intimidated by the physical disparity, which only fueled his aggression. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the car. Spread your legs," Grant barked, drawing his taser and aiming it squarely at Everett's chest. Everett complied silently. He turned around, placed his palms flat against the cool, dew-covered metal of the Chevelle's roof, and spread his feet. Grant stepped in hard, kicking Everett's left ankle to force his legs wider. The kick was entirely unnecessary, a petty act of violence meant to establish dominance. Everett's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, staring straight ahead into the darkness of the highway. Grant began a rough, invasive pat-down. He patted down Everett's legs, moving up to his waist, roughly checking his pockets. He pulled Everett's wallet out and tossed it onto the trunk of the car. "Got a lot of cash in here, Everett," Grant taunted, opening the wallet. "Drug money, or maybe you stole it from your commanding officer. You people always find a way to cheat the system." "I strongly suggest you look closely at the identification cards in that wallet, officer," Everett said, his voice dangerously low. "Before you make a mistake you cannot undo." Grant laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He pulled out Everett's military common access card. In the dim light of the cruiser's headlights, Grant didn't look at the rank insignia or the pay grade. He just saw the DoD logo and the picture of a black man. "Oh, look at this," Grant mocked, tossing the card down onto the trunk beside the wallet. "A government ID. Listen to me, grunt. I don't give a damn if you're a private or a sergeant. Out here, I'm the general, and right now, you're a suspect." Grant left Everett standing at the car and walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door and began tearing through the interior. He yanked the glove box open, scattering the neat stack of registration and insurance papers. He dug his hands under the pristine leather seats, scratching the upholstery with his duty belt as he leaned in. He opened the center console, tossing out loose change and a charging cable. Everett watched this defilement of his father's car out of the corner of his eye. A slow, cold fury began to build in his chest. It wasn't just the disrespect to the vehicle. It was the sheer impunity with which Grant operated. After several minutes of tearing the car apart, Grant emerged frustrated and empty-handed. There were no drugs. There were no weapons. There was nothing but the pristine belongings of a disciplined man. Grant slammed the passenger door shut with enough force to rock the heavy car. He stormed back around to Everett, his ego bruised by his failure to find justification for his bigotry. "Where are you hiding it?" Grant demanded, stepping uncomfortably close to Everett's back. "There is nothing to hide," Everett replied, his voice maintaining its glacial calm. "You have conducted an illegal search based on fabricated probable cause, and you have found nothing. Am I free to go?" "Free to go?" Grant whispered, leaning in so his breath was hot against Everett's neck. "You think you can come into my town, act like you're better than me, and just drive away? You don't tell me when you're free to go. You're going to learn some respect tonight. Grant grabbed Everett's left arm, yanking it violently behind his back. "Everett Lang," Grant shouted, his voice echoing into the empty night. "You are under arrest." "Under arrest?" Everett questioned, not resisting the physical manipulation of his arm, though his muscles tensed instinctively against the assault. "On what charge?" "Resisting an officer, disorderly conduct, and suspicion of driving under the influence." Grant rattled off without missing a beat. It was a rehearsed script, a blanket of garbage charges used to justify the unjustifiable. Grant unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt. He snapped the first cuff roughly onto Everett's left wrist, securing it tightly enough to bite into the skin. He grabbed Everett's right arm, forced it back, and ratcheted the second cuff closed. The cold steel locked with a final, definitive click. Everett stood perfectly still. He was a 3-star general in the United States Army. He commanded tens of thousands of troops, oversaw billions of dollars in military assets, and answered directly to the Pentagon. And right now, he was handcuffed in the dirt by a small-town coward. Let him play his hand, Everett reminded himself. The trap is set. "Turn around," Grant ordered, grabbing Everett by the shoulder and spinning him to face the cruiser. Everett looked Grant dead in the eyes. There was no fear in Everett's gaze, no panic, no subservience. There was only a terrifying, quiet calculation. Grant broke eye contact first, unnerved by the absolute lack of emotion in the man he was trying to break. "Get in the car," Grant grunted, pushing Everett toward the back of the police cruiser. Everett was forced to duck awkwardly into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside the claustrophobic space that smelled heavily of bleach and old vomit. Grant walked back over to the Chevelle. He grabbed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need a tow truck out on South Y-35 near mile marker 112. Vehicle impound." Everett's eyes narrowed in the back of the cruiser. Impounding the Chevelle was the final insult. It was a pure spite move, an attempt to inflict financial and emotional pain. Grant walked back to the cruiser carrying Everett's wallet and IDs. He threw them onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. He turned back to look at Everett through the heavy plexiglass divider. "Well, soldier," Grant said with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. "Looks like you're going to miss your morning formation. Don't worry, I'll be sure to call the base provost marshal tomorrow and let them know one of their boys is sitting in my jail. Your commanding officer is going to love hearing about this. I highly recommend you make that call tonight," Everett said smoothly, leaning back against the hard plastic seat as best as his cuffed hands would allow. "In fact, you should call your chief of police, Robert Shaw, right now. Tell him who you just arrested." Grant chuckled, putting the cruiser into gear. "You think you know Chief Shaw? You think dropping his name is going to scare me? Shaw and I are tight. He hates you military types coming into our town and acting like you own the place just as much as I do. He's going to laugh when I tell him I bagged a loudmouth grunt in a stolen classic." "I assure you," Everett replied, his eyes locking onto Grant's in the rearview mirror, "Robert Shaw will not be laughing." The drive to the Oak Creek Police Department took only minutes. "For the entire duration," Grant monologued. He bragged about his arrest record. He made veiled racist remarks about people from the city bringing crime to his quiet town. He gloated about the impound fees Everett would have to pay to get his car back, if they didn't civil asset forfeit it first. Everett listened in absolute silence. He committed every word, every insult, and every constitutional violation to his eidetic memory. The Oak Creek Police Station was a drab, single-story cinder block building with flickering fluorescent lights and a cracked asphalt parking lot. Grant pulled the cruiser around to the back entrance, the intake bay. He parked, got out, and opened the rear door. "Out!" he barked. Everett stepped out, his joints stiff from the awkward position. He was marched through a heavy steel door and into the harsh, glaring light of the booking area. The room was quiet. A single dispatcher, a middle-aged woman named Brenda, sat behind bulletproof glass filing her nails. She barely looked up as Grant shoved Everett toward the booking desk. "Got a live one, Brenda," Grant announced loudly, dropping Everett's wallet onto the counter. "Refused to search, acting aggressive. Going to process him for resisting." Brenda sighed, pulling a clipboard toward her. "Name?" she asked, her voice bored. "Hugo Lang," Grant answered for him. "Military guy, thinks he's special." Grant began emptying the contents of Everett's wallet onto the metal counter. Credit cards, a few folded bills, his civilian license, and finally his military ED. "Let's see just how important you are, Private," Grant sneered, picking up the common access card and actually looking at it under the bright lights of the station for the first time. Everett stood tall, the handcuffs restricting his arms, but his presence completely filling the room. He watched Grant's eyes scan the small, rigid plastic card. He watched Grant's eyes slide from the picture to the name, and finally to the rank insignia printed clearly on the front, LTG, Lieutenant General. Beneath that, the designation of his command, Commanding Officer, Joint Base Fort Kinsley. The silence in the booking room suddenly became deafening. The smug, arrogant grin on Officer Silas Grant's face didn't just fade. It evaporated, replaced by a pallor of absolute blood-draining horror. The harsh hum of the overhead fluorescent lights suddenly sounded like a jet engine in the suffocating silence of the booking room. Officer Silas Grant stared at the small piece of plastic in his trembling hand. He blinked hard once, twice, hoping the harsh glare was playing tricks on his vision, but the black letters remained stubbornly fixed in place. Lieutenant General, Base Commander. The blood drained from Grant's face so rapidly that his skin took on the sickly hue of old parchment. The cocky, swaggering bully who had terrorized the highway minutes ago vanished, replaced by a man realizing he had just stepped onto a live landmine. Behind the bulletproof glass, Brenda, the dispatcher, finally looked up, sensing the drastic shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. She squinted at Grant's frozen posture. "Silas?" Brenda asked, her voice crackling slightly through the intercom speaker. "What's the holdup? You want me to run his plates or what?" Grant couldn't speak. His throat bobbed as he tried to swallow, but his mouth was bone dry. He slowly rotated the common access card so Brenda could see it through the thick glass. Brenda leaned forward, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. She squinted at the text. When she processed the words, Fort Kinsley Base Commander, she literally dropped her nail file. It hit the floor with a sharp clack that made Grant jump. Brenda knew something Grant, in his arrogant ignorance, did not. She handled the department's payroll administration. She knew that a significant portion of Oak Creek Police Department's annual funding came directly from the Department of Defense Joint Jurisdiction Security Grant, a grant that required the physical signature of the Fort Kinsley Base Commander. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Brenda breathed into the microphone. Everett Lang stood perfectly still, his hands bound tightly behind his back. He did not smile. He did not gloat. His expression remained an unreadable mask of absolute, terrifying authority. He simply watched the panic bloom in the eyes of his captor. "General? General Lang?" Grant stammered, his voice cracking an octave higher. He practically dropped the ID onto the metal counter as if it were burning his fingers. "Sir, there's been a massive misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Everett repeated, his voice smooth and deadly calm. The deep timbre of his voice commanded the room without him having to raise it a single decibel.
"Yes, sir. Absolutely,"
Grant babbled, his hands shaking as he reached instinctively for his belt. "Look, it's dark out there on the interstate. The light was bad. I thought you were... I didn't realize. Let me just get those cuffs off you, General." Grant stepped forward, reaching out to turn Everett around to access the lock mechanism on the handcuffs. "Step back." Everett's voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't a request. It was a direct, immovable command, forged by decades of leading troops in hostile territories. Grant froze instantly, his hands hovering in the air. "You will not touch me, Officer Grant," Everett said, his eyes locking onto the terrified cop. "You placed these handcuffs on me under the assertion that I was resisting arrest and driving under the influence. You paraded me into this facility as a criminal. These cuffs will remain exactly where they are until your chief of police arrives to explain this department's standard operating procedures." "General, please," Grant begged, sweat beading on his forehead and dripping down his neck, staining the collar of his uniform. "If Chief Shaw sees this, he'll have my badge. It was just a mistake. You can go. You're free to go. I'll even drive you back to your car myself. My car, which you illegally searched, damaged and ordered to be impounded, Everett stated, outlining the facts with surgical precision. You fabricated probable cause, assaulted me during a pat-down, and violated my Fourth Amendment rights. You did this because you believed I was someone who possessed no power, someone you could humiliate with absolute impunity. Everett shifted his gaze to the glass window. Dispatcher, you're going to pick up the telephone, and you are going to call Chief Robert Shaw. You will wake him up. You will tell him that he has exactly 20 minutes to arrive at this precinct, or the first phone call I make will be to the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Brenda didn't hesitate. She scrambled for the red emergency desk phone, nearly knocking over her lukewarm coffee in the process. Her fingers flew across the keypad. "Chief, it's Brenda," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry to wake you, sir, but you need to get down to intake right now." "Yes, right now. It's a code black, Chief. Grant arrested the base commander of Fort Kinsley." There was a brief pause on the line. Even through the thick glass, Everett could hear the tinny, panicked shouting erupting from the receiver. Brenda hung up the phone and looked at Everett with wide, terrified eyes. "He's on his way, sir. 10 minutes. For the next 10 minutes, the booking room felt like a tomb. Grant stood awkwardly in the corner, his bravado entirely shattered. He looked like a cornered animal, shifting his weight from foot to foot, avoiding Everett's gaze at all costs. Everett remained standing in the center of the room, refusing the plastic chair Grant had frantically offered him. He wanted them to see him standing there, bound like a common criminal. He wanted the visual of this injustice permanently burned into their memories. Finally, the heavy rear doors of the precinct burst open. Chief Robert Shaw practically sprinted into the room. He was a heavily built man, his face flushed red with exertion and high blood pressure. He was wearing hastily thrown-on sweatpants and an unbuttoned uniform shirt over a white undershirt. He hadn't even taken the time to put on socks, wearing leather loafers over bare feet. Shaw burst into the intake area, his eyes darting frantically until they landed on Everett. When he saw the silver-haired, distinguished man standing there with his hands locked in cold steel, Shaw looked as if he might actually suffer a myocardial infarction right on the linoleum floor. "Mother of God," Shaw whispered. He whirled on Grant, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. "Grant, what the hell have you done?" "Chief, Grant started, his voice barely a squeak.
"Shut up!"
Shaw roared, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls. He rushed toward Everett, his hands visibly shaking. "General Lang, sir, I cannot begin to apologize for this atrocity. This is a monumental screw-up by an incompetent rookie. Let me remove those immediately." Shaw reached into his pocket for his master handcuff key. "Hold," Everett commanded. Shaw stopped dead in his tracks, the small silver key glinting in his trembling hand. "Chief Shaw," Everett said, looking the man up and down, noting the disheveled appearance and the scent of stale whiskey on the chief's breath. "Your officer assured me that you and he were tight. He assured me that you would laugh when he brought in a loudmouth grunt who dared to question his absolute authority." Shaw glared at Grant with enough hatred to melt steel. "General, I assure you I have no idea what this imbecile is talking about. He does not speak for me, and he certainly does not speak for the Oak Creek Police Department." "But he does, Chief," Everett countered smoothly. "He wears your uniform. He carries a weapon issued by your armory. He enforces the law under your direct supervision. When he decided to racially profile me, illegally detain me, and manufacture charges against me, he was acting as the official representative of this town." Everett took a slow, deep breath, maintaining his iron composure. "Now you may remove the restraints." Shaw scrambled forward, his hands fumbling frantically with the key. The metal clicked twice, and the cuffs fell away. Everett brought his arms forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the steel had bitten into his skin. He didn't stretch or massage the joints too deeply. He refused to show them an ounce of pain or discomfort. "Now," Everett said, looking between the terrified officer and the sweating chief of police, "I'm going to make my phone call. Chief Shaw hovered near the desk, sweating profusely, gesturing vaguely toward the department's landline. "Please, General, use my private office line. We can sort this out. I'll dismiss the charges immediately. I'll personally drive you to the base. We can keep this between us." "The time to keep things between us expired the moment your officer put his hands on me," Everett replied coldly. He ignored Shaw's offer of the office phone and reached into his own pocket, withdrawing his personal smartphone. It was a miracle Grant hadn't confiscated it. Likely too distracted by his own power trip, Everett dialed a secure number from memory. It rang only once. "Reynolds," a sharp, alert voice answered.
"David, it's Everett,"
General Lang said, his tone shifting from cold authority to standard military professionalism. On the other end of the line, Colonel David Reynolds, the Provost Marshal of Fort Kinsley, the man in charge of the entire military police force for the region, sat up straight in his bed. "General Lang, sir, are you all right? You weren't expected on base until morning." "I encountered a slight delay in the town of Oak Creek," Everett explained, his eyes fixed dead on Chief Shaw.
"I am currently at the Oak Creek Municipal Police Station. I have been arrested."
There was a profound silence on the line, then a sharp intake of breath. "Excuse me, General. Did you say arrested?" Reynolds' voice dropped an octave, radiating immediate hostility. "I did," Everett confirmed. "False arrest, illegal search and seizure, and racial profiling by an officer named Silas Grant. My vehicle has also been unlawfully impounded. I need you to mobilize a detail. Bring a JAG officer. I want you here shortly." "I'm scrambling a rapid response unit right now, sir," Colonel Reynolds barked, the sound of boots hitting the floor audible over the phone. "We will be there in minutes." Everett hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned to face Shaw and Grant, who were watching him with the helpless expressions of men tied to railroad tracks, listening to the whistle of an oncoming freight train. "My military police are en route," Everett announced. "Until they arrive, nobody leaves this room. Dispatcher, do not touch that computer terminal. Do not attempt to delete body camera footage or alter the intake log. If any data vanishes between now and the moment my JAG officer arrives, I will ensure federal tampering charges are brought against every single one of you." Brenda yanked her hands away from her keyboard as if the keys had suddenly turned to hot coals. The next several minutes were excruciatingly long for the Oak Creek police. Shaw paced the room, running his hands over his balding head, muttering under his breath. Grant remained rooted in the corner, staring at the floor, the reality of his ruined career finally crashing down upon him. Everett simply stood at ease, his hands clasped behind his back, a monument of disciplined patience. Exactly on time, the quiet night was shattered by the roar of heavy engines. It wasn't the wail of sirens, but the deep guttural rumble of high-performance tactical vehicles. Red and blue lights flooded the windows of the precinct, throwing chaotic strobe-like shadows across the cinder-block walls. Outside, a column of matte black military police SUVs had sealed off the precinct parking lot. Doors flew open in perfect synchronization. The front doors of the station didn't just open. They were aggressively pushed wide. Colonel David Reynolds strode into the room. He was fully uniformed in his tactical gear, his sidearm strapped tightly to his thigh, his face a mask of furious, unyielding authority. Behind him filed several heavily armed military police soldiers, their hands resting cautiously on their vests, their eyes sweeping the room for threats. Trailing them was Captain Elena Voss, a military lawyer from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, clutching a hardened digital tablet. The local station felt instantly claustrophobic, overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the military detail. "General Lang, sir," Colonel Reynolds said, snapping a razor-sharp salute. The soldiers behind him mirrored the action perfectly. "At ease, Colonel," Everett replied, returning the salute crisply. Reynolds lowered his hand and turned his glare upon Chief Shaw. "Which one of you is in command of this facility?" Shaw stepped forward, looking incredibly small despite his large frame. "I am, Chief Robert Shaw. Look, Colonel, this is a terrible misunderstanding." "Shut your mouth," Reynolds snapped, cutting off the chief of police in his own station. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You detained a 3-star general of the United States Armed Forces. You harassed the base commander of Fort Kinsley. My only question right now is where the general's property is, and who is going to be held accountable. Captain Elena Voss stepped forward, her tablet glowing. Chief Shaw, I am Captain Voss, JAG Corps. I am formally requesting all body camera footage, dash camera footage, audio recordings, and the written arrest report regarding General Lang. I am also informing you that the Department of Defense is officially opening an investigation into this department's conduct. Shaw looked like he was about to cry. We don't have a written report yet. The officer just brought him in. Excellent, Everett said, breaking his silence. He walked slowly toward Officer Grant, who was visibly shaking now, shrinking back against the wall. Officer Grant, Everett said, his voice quiet but echoing with terrible finality. Earlier tonight, you asked me what I was smuggling into your jurisdiction. You demanded to know what kind of power I thought I had in your town. Everett stopped just a foot away from the disgraced cop. Let me show you. Everett turned to his JAG officer. Captain Voss, first thing tomorrow morning, you will draft an immediate suspension of the Joint Jurisdiction Security Grant to the town of Oak Creek, effective immediately. Cite gross civil rights violations and lack of command oversight as the primary cause. Brenda gasped loudly behind the glass. Chief Shaw staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. General, no, you can't, Shaw pleaded, his voice breaking. That grant pays for our cruisers, our armor, half our salaries. If you pull that funding, the city council will disband this department within a month. We'll be bankrupt. Then you should have trained your men to uphold the Constitution, rather than treating their badges as licenses to terrorize citizens, Everett replied, devoid of any sympathy. You allowed a culture of bigotry and arrogance to fester under your command, Chief. I am merely removing the taxpayer funding that subsidizes it. Everett turned back to Colonel Reynolds. Colonel, send a recovery team to the impound lot to retrieve my vehicle. If there is so much as a single scratch on the paint that was not there yesterday, add destruction of property to the list of federal charges.
Yes, sir,
Reynolds barked, gesturing to two of his soldiers who immediately turned and marched out the door. Everett looked at Grant one last time. You wanted to ruin someone's life tonight, officer. You succeeded. It just happens to be your own. Without another word, General Everett Lang turned and walked out of the precinct, flanked by his military escort, leaving the corrupt ruins of the Oak Creek Police Department crumbling in his wake. The sun began to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and burning orange. It was the same sun that usually signaled the start of a new day at Fort Kinsley, a day filled with drills, administrative briefings, and the rhythmic march of soldiers. But for the town of Oak Creek, this dawn brought only the cold, harsh light of reality. By morning, the parking lot of the Oak Creek Police Department had become the epicenter of a localized earthquake. The news of the base commander's arrest had spread through the police ranks like a viral contagion. Officers arriving for their morning shift found themselves walking into a crime scene, not of a murder or a robbery, but of a systemic collapse. Captain Elena Voss and her legal team had been working through the night. They had seized the servers, logged the digital evidence, and were currently drafting the official documentation that would trigger the federal review. Chief Robert Shaw sat in his office, his head buried in his hands. The door was open, and he could hear the murmurs of his officers in the hallway, the ones who knew that their benefits, their equipment upgrades, and their very job security were tied to the budget the general had just effectively incinerated. He looked up as the office door creaked open. It was Grant. The younger officer looked like he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and the swagger that had defined his existence for years was entirely absent. "Chief," Grant croaked, his voice raw. Shaw stood up, his face reddening. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He simply looked at the younger man with a deep, weary disdain. "You realize what you've done, Silas. You didn't just arrest a man. You arrested the person who kept the lights on in this department. You didn't just stop a car. You stopped the entire flow of federal funding to our jurisdiction." I had no idea who he was," Grant stammered. "He was in a beat-up old car. He looked like a civilian. He didn't tell me who he was." "That is exactly the point," Shaw hissed, walking around the desk to stand inches from Grant. It shouldn't have mattered if he was a general or a janitor. You treated him like a piece of garbage because you thought you could get away with it. You thought that behind that badge you were untouchable. Well, congratulations, Silas. You've touched the wrong wire, and now the whole town is going to go dark." A knock on the doorframe interrupted them. It was Colonel Reynolds. He looked at the two men with the cold, detached gaze of a soldier assessing a tactical failure. "Officer Grant," Reynolds said, "you are to surrender your service weapon, your badge, and your duty belt immediately. You are being placed on administrative leave pending a federal investigation into civil rights violations and official misconduct. You are ordered to remain within the county limits. Do you understand?" Grant's hand trembled as he unbuckled his belt. He placed his gear on the desk with a heavy thud. It sounded like the final period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. "Chief Shaw," Reynolds continued, turning his attention to the chief, "the Joint Base Provost Marshal's office is assuming temporary oversight of all law enforcement interactions involving military personnel within this town's jurisdiction. Every report, every ticket, and every arrest involving a service member will be reviewed by my office starting now. If we find even a hint of the systemic profiling we've witnessed, the base will officially designate Oak Creek a hostile jurisdiction. That would mean a total lockdown of the base, forbidding any personnel from entering this town. We will take our business and our money elsewhere." Shaw paled. The economic death knell for a town like Oak Creek wasn't the law. It was the loss of the military dollar. If the base went dark, the bars, the pawn shops, the car lots, and the restaurants would fold within weeks. "I understand, Colonel," Shaw whispered. "I think you do," Reynolds said. As the sun rose higher, the military convoy moved out. General Lang was already gone, having returned to the base to oversee the changing of the guard. But his presence still loomed over the station. The atmosphere was one of profound, suffocating dread. The story, however, was just beginning. In the age of digital information, secrets in a place like Oak Creek didn't stay secret for long. By midday, the story of the midnight arrest had hit the national news wires. It wasn't just a local spat anymore. It was a high-profile case of institutional racism and abuse of power centered on a man as decorated and respected as Lieutenant General Everett Lang. The footage from Grant's own body camera, which he had been so proud of activating to record his authority, had been released by the Department of Defense. It was a harrowing watch. The world heard Grant's condescending tone, his racist insinuations, and his blatant attempt to manufacture probable cause. They watched as he mocked a man who remained calm, dignified, and terrifyingly composed. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Protests erupted in front of the Oak Creek City Hall. Taxpayers, many of whom were retired military or local families who had long suffered under the department's iron-fisted discriminatory tactics, demanded the immediate resignation of Chief Shaw and the prosecution of Officer Grant. The city council held an emergency meeting that evening. With the federal funding frozen and the threat of a full military boycott looming, the council moved with unprecedented speed. Chief Shaw was forced to resign under public pressure, and the entire department was placed under the oversight of a state-appointed receiver. As for Officer Silas Grant, he found himself a social pariah. His neighbors, who had once looked the other way, now refused to speak to him. He was the face of everything wrong with the system. He faced multiple federal charges, and his badge was taken, never to be returned. But the true impact of that night was felt inside the gates of Fort Kinsley. General Lang officially took command the next morning. He stood before his troops, a man who had been harassed, handcuffed, and humiliated just hours earlier. He didn't speak of his experience in the town. He didn't mention the officer who had tried to break his spirit. Instead, he spoke of dignity. "We are here to protect the values of this nation," General Lang told the assembled thousands, his voice ringing out across the parade ground. "That protection doesn't end at the base gates. It starts with how we treat every single person we encounter, and it demands that we hold those who violate the law to the highest standard of accountability. True power is not the ability to force someone to their knees. True power is the integrity to stand tall when everyone else is trying to force you down." The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't just a tribute to his rank. It was an acknowledgement of his character. Everett Lang had walked through the fire of prejudice and emerged with his command and his humanity fully intact. He had taught a small town a very big lesson about the nature of power, and he had done it in a way that ensured the world would never forget the man in the 1968 Chevelle. The Chevelle, by the way, was returned the following day. It had been detailed, polished, and checked for any damage. It sat now in the general's parking space, a simple classic machine standing in stark contrast to the modern military tech that surrounded it. It was a reminder that no matter the uniform you wear, or the badge you carry, or the power you think you hold, justice has a way of finding its way home. And sometimes it arrives in a classic muscle car at midnight, with the weight of the entire United States Army riding right behind it. The story of General Lang and Officer Grant serves as a powerful reminder. You never know who you are dealing with, and you certainly never know who is watching. Power is not a license to abuse, and arrogance is a fatal flaw in anyone who serves the public. When you stand up for what is right, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, you change the world. If this story inspired you to stand tall, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more real-life dramas of justice served.